Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here. I'd like to extend my thanks to Flinders University, of course, and also to Altamimi. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity. So let's get into it. I will try and share my screen, and perhaps you can just let me know if I've shared successfully.
Yes.
Yes. Wonderful. Excellent. All right. Well, what I want to talk about today is some of the key issues for governance, particularly when considering international business. There's a lot of things that are very particular to the jurisdiction that you want to go into in terms of governance, but there's actually a lot that keeps us common, and there's some common ground amongst jurisdictions as well. So I wanted to go through some of those similarities and differences. I thought I'd start off by asking what's often asked of me, and that is, what is governance? And governance can actually mean many different things to many people. We put out a question to our own staff asking them what they thought governance meant, and they indicated a number of different words, and we made up this word chart for governance. But fundamentally, we see it as a framework that allows organisations to make good decisions. So if you think of a building, it's like the scaffolding of the building. It allows the architect to design a beautiful building, but it also allows the engineers to ensure that the building is standing up and is structurally sound. So governance is really very simply a framework for decision making, and it involves a lot of different elements, but at its core, it's really a very simple thing. And we like to actually describe it as doing the right thing the right way at the right time. And I thought it was really important to start with that definition, because we'll actually come right back to that at the end when we consider different international governance structures. So one of the things that we know, and particularly we know through the last 2 years of the pandemic, is that the world continues to get a smaller and smaller place. We are more interconnected than we ever were before. COVID has accelerated quite a bit of that. We see organisations that are striving to really update their business models and hoping to reinvent themselves in a post-COVID world, using technology to drive those business models, using technology to mitigate against the tyranny of distance, and to reach new markets and new territories for goods and services. There's a lot of performance drivers. So we know, for example, in Australia that nearly half of the ASX 100 companies generate more than 30% of their revenues from international jurisdictions or from overseas. And of those ASX 100 companies that grew their offshore, they also showed the highest shareholder returns of those top companies in Australia. So we know that there's a lot of performance drivers in terms of opening up to new markets. But we also know that there are a lot of risks involved in moving into new markets. So one of the things that we like to draw upon at the Governance Institute is thinking through governance from a risk management lens. And we know that when we look at international jurisdictions, that there are obviously some of the cultural norms that we have to navigate as business people. There's the different customs, there's the different government systems, different regulations. And so all of these things have to be taken into consideration because they are all part of that framework that we talked about, which is governance. And we also have to think about some of the particular pitfalls apart from just different countries, different jurisdictions being generally different. There are particular pieces of legislation or particular areas of risk that we need to be particularly concerned about. For example, foreign bribery offences and corruption, certain supply chain issues, certain trade barriers. And so we really need to be thinking about all of those things. We see most businesses, in fact, will fail going into international markets, not because they don't have adequate goods, products or services, but because they fail to understand the foreign market that they're entering into and some of the trade restrictions that they see. I've just been told I'm not in full screen mode. Is that correct? Excuse me for a moment while I try and fix that. Let me see if I can expand the panel. My apologies. Just unshare that screen. I'm going to try and share this screen instead. Share screen, and I'm hoping that I am now sharing the correct screen. I'm sure that one of my staff is going to comment.
So, Megan, we can actually see your slides, but if you can just hit presentation mode.
I'm currently in presentation mode.
So it's a, can you hit F5?
F5, I can. I just hit F5. Is that sorted things out?
No.
Hi, Megan. This is Chris from Tech Support. Did you want to just try and if you go back into the sharing screen and just share the actual screen, just actually exit out of the PowerPoint that you've obviously gone full screen into?
Okay, let me try and do that for a moment.
And then instead of sharing just the PowerPoint window, try and share your actual screen and then go full screen once you've shared.
Sorry, can you repeat that instruction again?
Yep. So just go
one at a time.
Just go into the share screen option and then share only the screen that's got the PowerPoint on it.
Yeah.
And then hit the carousel mode, which is either F5 or down the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little, slideshow. Just click that.
All right. Am I in business?
No, you are not.
No, I'm not. Oh dear. Hang on a second. We'll see if we can change. I'm going to swap presenter view. Now, are we in business now?
We're in business.
Yay. Thank you very much for your
Thank you,
patience.
Christopher.
Thanks, Christopher. Okay, where was I up to? So we were just talking about the risks involved in entering into international markets. And one of the things that we really need to be aware of is the things, obviously, that you would want to know in terms of understanding those different markets. So I'm going to go through those, and this is really the bulk of the presentation today that I have for you. So these are some of the elements where we know corporate governance differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There's some commonalities and some frameworks, once again, some themes that we can have a look at. So one of the things that differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction is ownership structures. We have, for example, in Anglo-American markets, very diversified ownership through share systems, through corporate share markets. And then we have some jurisdictions, for example, some of the Asian systems and certainly more of the systems in the UAE where we have more concentrated ownership structures, and it might be ownership by a family unit or by a bank or by a government department even. We see different orientations of the network. So we see, for example, an insider network where there's a lot of insider control versus an outsider network where the market has a significant degree of control over what happens with shares. Talking about shares, we have some significant differences between markets. We've been talking about in the European, Anglo-American markets for many years around shareholder primacy, and that is that the business operates to the benefit of the shareholders first and foremost. However, that dialogue's been very much changing, and we see other markets and other jurisdictions where the corporate world has a much broader view. And so in those markets, we see corporate governance being responsible to the larger stakeholder market, and that is employees, customers, regulators, governments, and so forth. So there's some huge differences there in terms of the way that the firm is both perceived, but also how it defines its own purpose. And that changes how corporate governance decisions are very much made. Of course, you have different jurisdictions with different legal systems, different systems of civil law, common law, contract law, corporate law, bankruptcy, and of course, attached to those different legal systems, you'll have different regulatory environments with different regulatory structures and rules. So that will differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction as well. Layered upon that, of course, is some of the international regulations that we see. And so that's something that I think organisations also need to take into account, is not just the different regulatory systems, but how they interplay with international regulatory systems and each other through that process. We see firms with different structures. So we see firms that are very relationship-based, once again, more Asian governance styles, and Latin American governance styles, for example, are far more based on relationships, whereas traditional European Anglo-American style is very much arm's length. And that is that the decision-making base, i.e. the board of directors, is loosely connected with the shareholders through constitutional rights and shareholder rights. However, the decision-making power really does vest with the board of directors. We also see in different markets very much different historical differences and expectations. That is, the expectations of governments and regulators with regards to how the firm operates in its social environment, the broader social context in those environments. And that's where the way that things are done, the framework for decision-making that I referred to before, doing the right thing in the right way, what is deemed to be right in one culture, or at least done in the right way in one culture, may not be the right way in another culture, because there'll be different elements of transparency, for example, different elements of directness, different language implications, different cultural implications. We also see, of course, some very significant cultural implications with regards to how executives and staff are remunerated, how compensation systems are based. So, for example, in some jurisdictions, we'll see compensation based around merit. In others, it might be based around seniority. In others, it might be based around short or medium-term performance measures. In others, it might be around long-term performance measures and long-term share and ownership structures. So there'll be quite a difference in terms of how remuneration and compensation are handled based on the jurisdiction that you're entering. I mentioned before board control. We also have a significant difference in terms of the systems in which you're operating. So some of the governance models around the world have what we call a one-tier system, that is a board of directors that is directly in control of management, and others have two-tiered systems. So they'll have an advisory board of owners advising an executive board of managers, or they'll have a management board that is separate from an advisory board or a non-executive director board. So there are some differences to look out for as well. And then, of course, we have the different political drivers. We know that the corporate structure and the politics of the day are often interlinked. So you might have corporate failures or corporate scandals that are responded to by governments with changes in legislation or regulation, tightening of regulation, for example. So it's very important to be aware of those political drivers when you're entering into a new jurisdiction as well, because they can have a significant impact not only on the environment that you're operating in today, but the likely future state environment that you'll be operating in a particular jurisdiction. So each system is very much dependent on its history, on circumstance, and on the culture of each nation. So, for example, the Australian corporate governance system is very much based on the Anglo-American system of common law, based on our colonial history, of course, with the UK. And our corporate governance system needs to be viewed within that context, and particularly in the context of our social and political arena. For example, in Australia, socially, it's a very progressive social nation, and different nations will have different levels of social, both cohesion and progressiveness, and that's something to keep an eye on. In the next slide, I've actually brought up one of the many different models that you'll see if you have a Google of different corporate governance models around the world, or comparison types. And this explains a little of what the previous slide was sharing. So you can see there that in the United States, you've got differences from the United Kingdom, which is different from how things are in Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland. Once again, there's a strong Japanese style model, which is very much based around Asian culture. And the thing that I'll get to next is what some of the system differences are in the MENA jurisdiction, of course. So, for example, how independent auditors are appointed, how the CEO or chair roles are separated, or whether they are dual purpose roles, whether there's mandatory legislation and requirements with regards to best practice and good governance, you can see on this screen, it's just, as I said, one of many different charts that you can Google and pull up to describe the different corporate governance structures. So I wanted to then turn to governance in MENA in particular, in the jurisdiction that we're talking about today. Because I think it is important to identify some of the key differences, particularly between the Australian Anglo-American system and the system that is the predominant system in MENA. So MENA definitely, the different jurisdictions have a bit of a hybrid system. It's a little bit of a hybrid between the Anglo-American style and the continental German style of governance. There are some common features, particularly throughout the region. Obviously, the featuring of Islam as the predominant religion through the region, and I'll come to that a little bit in a moment, but also the predominance of the major structures and the major important resources of the regions. The importance of crude oil, for example, comes to mind. So there are some common features amongst the region. One of the important things, of course, that we know is that the region is dominated to a degree by Sharia law. And one of the features of the jurisdictions is Sharia supervisory boards. And these are actually really important, and I'm going to come back to those later. One of the things that we note with the supervisory boards is they're an additional governing body of scholars with backgrounds in finance and economics, but they look at those through the lens of being compatible with Sharia law. For example, not investing in tobacco or alcohol and other such prohibited areas. So we know that these are quite important. One of the things that we know about the corporate governance system in the MENA regions is that it's a system that's very much still in development, but that development is speeding up due to governments and private entities, particularly partnering with the OECD, but also the convergence of global financial structures and global financing systems. So some, for example, of the global finance areas are dictating some of the future trends, and I'll come to that just in a moment. Excuse me. One of the other common features, of course, is that we see very much a predominance of financial institutions being in the top companies in the MENA region. In fact, banks constituted 51% of the top 100 listed companies in the Middle East in 2019. So banks and institutions all fall under Sharia law, as mentioned previously. And the final very, very predominant feature of organisations in the MENA regions are that they are family owned. In fact, 80% of institutions and organisations in the region are family owned, including organisations owned by royal families. And that is, despite diluted share structures, the family unit is still very influential in the governance and running of the organisation. So these are the key elements of MENA countries. But one of the things that I wanted to discuss today was one of the things that governance experts have been studying, in fact, for a number of years now, and that is the global trend, the overall trend. And the big question here is, as a global governance community, are we diverging in terms of our governance structures, or are we, in fact, converging in terms of our governance structures? So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the idea of convergence versus divergence. Now, this is very interesting because what we've seen, particularly once again over the last 2 years, is a fluctuation back towards nationalism in terms of political arena. So we've seen, for example, nationalism with supply chains, with global supply chains, countries wanting to be more self-sufficient in terms of their trade structures. But what we see, however, when we look over the longer period is, despite periods of nationalisation and then globalisation, the long-term trend is driven by a couple of really key factors. And they're up on the board there. So we look at the international financing systems around the drivers behind, for example, the unilateral world banks and the lending criteria that they would be applying, some of the influence over governance structures that they apply through procurement structures, through the requirements for international lending. We see the globalisation of supply chains. One of the things that we know for country productivity is that it is not the most efficient use of resources to do everything yourself. So different countries will specialise in different areas. Of course, Australia has specialised in the resources sector. As mentioned before, many MENA countries would specialise in crude oil as a key commodity. And many of the corporate governance structures are built around that globalisation of supply chain that is needed for the productive use of capital through the corporate structures. And the third area that's really driving this long-term globalisation is international standardisation, whether that be through the International Standards Organisation or the or other structures. And I'm going to come to ESG structures, for example, in a moment. But we see more and more global best practice coming out of some of these global structures, the international structures, and that is also a driver in the argument for convergence over the long term, even though we will see an oscillating period of divergence in short-termism. So what does all this convergence mean? Well, it means we come back to the fact that we actually have a lot more in common than we do different, even though I described the multitude of differences between corporate governance systems throughout the world. The connection that we have really does mean that we have to see and find faith in our commonalities rather than our differences. For example, I look at the Australian systems of governance and I look at the Middle Eastern governance structures. And what I see very much is them both being driven by increasingly a common ground moral code. That is the code to do no harm, to be bigger than yourself, to be driven by purpose, to be driven by community. And organisations bound by Sharia law, for example, have a moral responsibility to help governments alleviate social differences, improve human rights, and instill sustainable socio-economic development practices. One of the interesting things that we're seeing in this great trend of convergence is exactly that. And I think the biggest debate for that is really coming from the US, which has traditionally been seen as very much a capitalist democracy, very much driven by what we call shareholder primacy. That is the purpose of the organisation or the firm is to provide dividends to shareholders rather than to do any social good. And yet that's really changing. So, for example, the US Business Council, the Business Roundtable, since 1978, the Roundtable's been providing periodic issued principles and guidelines for corporate governance. And each version of the document since 1997 has endorsed the principles of shareholder primacy, that corporations exist principally to serve their shareholders. However, we saw a really big shift away from that in 2019, where 181 different CEOs committed to leading their companies for the benefit of all stakeholders, that is, customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and shareholders. And I think, importantly, shareholders came at the back end of that statement rather than the forefront. They mentioned that each of our stakeholders is essential. We commit to delivering the value to all of them for the future success of our companies, our communities, and our country. At the Governance Institute, and in Australia, I would say, there's been much debate over the move away from shareholder primacy to more of a stakeholder view of the world. But one of the things that we would contest at the Governance Institute is the two of those aren't mutually differentiated. That all it depends on is the time frame. And I do believe that we are seeing organisations that are taking a much more long-term view of the world. They're taking a sustainability approach, which means that they want to be around not just for today and not for the short-term profits, but for the long term. And that's really driving a change in business behaviour, and I think driving a convergence between the different systems of governance, particularly as I compare, for example, Australia and some of the Middle Eastern governance systems. So I wanted to touch now on some tips for what you might look out for when you're going global, and then I'm going to spend a few moments just talking about ESG principles. So, of course, I mentioned before that there are very, very different systems of governance, and it's incumbent upon anyone looking to enter into an international jurisdiction that they should definitely seek to understand, of course, the political landscape, the economic environment, and the social environment that they're entering into. Definitely do your research and understand the local governance systems, and particularly how not just the doing the right thing, but the right way in the right time. So making sure that you understand all of the regulatory impacts and how they will affect decision making and how they'll affect upon the culture of your firm, because it depends on whether you're going to internationalize by having what we call boots on the ground, i.e. having a local workforce, or whether you're entering international markets with service agreements or using technology, because we really do need to be sensitive to those cultural implications. One of the things that I always suggest, of course, is having a network. The Governance Institute of Australia is, in fact, just the Australian division of our international peak body, the Chartered Governance Institute, which has members all around the world. And that's a fantastic mechanism to have a great network where you can ask advice of your international compatriots with regards to what you should be looking out for when you're entering into different markets. Of course, you need to stay up to date with your local law, because you can't just ignore one and go for the other. We'll always need to be complying, and you'll need to be adhering to your local law as well. So one thing that I would definitely suggest is that you engage professionals to assist you in this task. The Chartered Governance Institute is an organisation of many hundreds of thousands of governance professionals, so that and these people are fully qualified and trained in understanding these different systems, and also come with that network that I spoke about earlier. Now, looking ahead, I wanted to just spend a few minutes on ESG and understanding what ESG really means. And of course, ESG has gone through many iterations over the years. It was previously called things like triple bottom line reporting or quadruple bottom line reporting, CSR, corporate social responsibility. But the drive towards ESG has really reached a tipping point over the last couple of years in terms of it being a significant and permanent trend in corporate governance. It is now no longer a nice to have, it is absolutely a must have. And the reason for that, once again, goes back to that long-term sustainability of organisations. Interestingly, good governance and its correlation to performance has often been studied, but not really necessarily been proven by academic research in the past. So there's not naturally a correlation between good governance and better corporate performance in the short term. What there is, though, is a really strong correlation between good corporate governance and organisational sustainability, that is, organisations being around for the long term. And part of ESG is really around crafting that framework of good governance to make sure that that is the case. So better governance, as I said, makes better decisions for the health of the company over the long term. It creates more unified teams. As we know, more unified teams and happier employees make for happier customers, make for happier shareholder returns. So there's a performance benefit and uplift coming out of good governance as well. It makes for better stakeholder relationships, more value coming from from employees. That's contributing to the bottom line of the firm in the short term. That is less turnover, more productive relationships, more efficiencies internally. And higher ESG standards also reduce reputational risk. When we look at ESG, of course, we mean environment coming into play, things like climate change risk, for example, sustainability elements, use of energy, use of waste in your organisation. Of course, social, we look at giving back to the community, at strengthening community and social fabric, and governance I've spoken about at length, so I won't go over again. We know that reputational risk is part of the fabric that makes a firm sustainable, and ESG goes to the heart and soul of reputational risk. A classic example of this was Volkswagen, where the stock price went into absolute free fall after the world found out essentially that they were cheating on the emissions testing of their vehicles in September of 2015. So there is certainly a reputational correlation for good governance, and that reputational correlation can have a direct impact on short-term share price. So it is very, very important. One of the things that companies need to be very careful and aware of, however, when they're thinking about their ESG responsibilities, and in particular thinking about reporting against those, is not to be blasé or complacent. That organisations, particularly with social media and the immediacy of information these days, that firms are completely transparent. We've seen a lot of greenwashing, for example, companies making glib statements around how environmentally friendly they are that weren't necessarily backed up by the credentials to prove. So we need to be very careful when we're thinking about greenwashing with regards to environmental claims and not making misleading statements about their products to appear more ESG friendly but not really be so. And certainly there's regulation in a number of jurisdictions to guard against that type of thing from happening. We also need to be careful in making statements around social issues, being very much, once again, aware of the surroundings, thinking about things like, for example, cancel culture and the Me Too movement, some of the social movements that are at play, and making sure that they're connected in with very, very transparent policy. So what we're seeing in, for example, the MENA jurisdictions, we're seeing nations that are really beginning to invest in ESG very, very seriously and very transparently, which is really great to see. Some of the initiatives, for example, I've been looking at is the Net Zero by 2050 initiatives of the UAE, the Green Sukuk, Egyptian government issuing green bonds. There's so many initiatives that are coming out of really all of our jurisdictions, but the Middle East is, I have to say, leading the way in many instances. What's next in this area of ESG? Well, it is a march that will keep on marching. One of the things that we are looking at the Governance Institute is things like mandated climate risk and financial reporting against climate risk or potential climate risk and financial disclosure. We, for example, are seeing more and more come out of the international community. For example, the Global Plastic Treaty that's recently been signed by 175 countries in order to reduce plastic waste. So there is a lot going on in this ESG space, and once again, it is definitely an area of convergence where those international links that I spoke about before are coming to the fore to give us more in common than we have difference. So at that point in time, I will finalise my presentation, and I'm very happy to have a conversation with you and take some questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was very insightful. We do have time for a question or two. If there are people online, they can type their question in the chat. Anyone in the room want to have a go?
Okay, so the question is, so we're talking about a framework for the Middle East, and all I see actually numbers are coming out of, can you all hear me, by the way?
I can hear you.
Yeah, so it seems that it's the, everything you spoke about to this point, it talks about the Middle East as one big country. Did you actually look into looking at, like, you know, kind of regioning the Middle East into places where a framework would actually work, or there is more in common than actually differences?
So the framework is not necessarily about the decisions that are made, but it's really the lens through which you make those decisions. So when we look at the frameworks that I mentioned previously, it's not so much around saying that, for example, the CEO and chair role should be separate or should be co-joined, but that organisations within those jurisdictions would be accustomed to the preference of one over the other. So, for example, in the American system, we see chairs often being the CEO, but in the Australian jurisdictions, best practice is that those roles should most definitely be separated. And when we're looking at the individual country frameworks, there is, in fact, no, as you've rightly mentioned, there's no one size fits all. It very much is country based, but they're a mismatch of those different mechanisms or lenses that I provided earlier in my presentation that you can have a look at. I couldn't actually find a comprehensive review of governance structures throughout the Middle East or the MENA region more broadly that compared and contrasted the different governance systems. So perhaps that's a future piece of research. That's an interesting one for someone in the jurisdiction or an academic to do. But there's no direct comparison that I was able to put my hand on other than looking through the lens of those general frameworks.
Thank you, Megan. We have a question online. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is going through a transformation, the likes of which has not been seen since China transitioned into a capitalist, yet centrally controlled economy. As more and more government entities are created and reshaped, what are key governance matters that should be considered from your perspective?
That's a great question. I think the first and foremost answer to that when any jurisdiction is going through a time of rapid change, and in fact we've seen that even right across the world during COVID, where so many of our systems have changed, is to be at the forefront of that change, to be looking at the trend line ahead and staying one step ahead of the curve. So one of the pieces of advice that I would give in a jurisdiction that is going through rapid change is to look at some of the lead indicators that would give you an indication of where the lay of the land is likely to fall at the end of that transition process. So having a look, for example, at some of the major trade partners, some of the major political events, some of the major cultural indicators that would suggest where some of that change is moving towards. And particularly, as I said, looking at things like international standards, international financing arrangements, some of the international supply chains, partnering arrangements, and seeing how they interplay with what has traditionally been common practice in a jurisdiction. And I'll give you just one example of something we've seen in COVID in Australia. We've seen an enormous dynamism in terms of how business is done, because our corporate structures in Australia, our Corporations Act, the underlying piece of legislation, was in fact drafted 20 years ago and hasn't gone through much reform ever since its sort of most recent version, the 2001 version. What that meant was we had to have all of our annual general meetings in a face-to-face format. Now, of course, with social distancing in COVID, that was in contravention of the public health orders given by governments around the country. So we had to have some temporary amendments to our legislation, and they have now evolved into some permanent amendments. But we find this sort of change happening all of the time because legislation is, by its very nature, often very slow to respond to the changes in the business landscape and the expediency with which that change is occurring. Another classic example that we've seen in Australia is just in terms of how business is done, how documents are signed and executed. So we required previously, and still do in many jurisdictions, wet ink signatures, that is the physical signing of certain type of documents. Well, we know in the world of the internet and high-speed internet that most documentation is signed in an electronic format, but the legislation hasn't kept pace with that social and technological trend. So one of the things to be aware of is how those trends, social trends, technology trends, political trends, underpinned by some of those drivers that I mentioned before, are going to play out. And I think, once again, being connected in with a network of like-minded peers to be having those conversations, because business doesn't operate in isolation in a jurisdiction. You're in the same boat, if you like, with all of the other businesses in your jurisdiction, and they'll have a lot of tips and hints. And one of the great strengths, for example, of the Governance Institute and our members is sharing advice across companies that is not in contradiction of their competitive arrangements, because it's not sharing IP or trade secrets or know-how in terms of the commercial aspects of the business, but it's sharing how do you do things, how do you deal with government, how do you fill in the forms, how do you get the answer from the regulator more quickly. So sharing information like that amongst peer groups is really, really important to be keeping both abreast of what you can do right now, but also thinking about the trends coming down the track.
Thank you very much, Megan. We appreciate your time. Thank you for the Governance Institute of Australia for arranging for us to listen to you. Please feel free to connect with Megan or the GIA online, and we look forward to being in touch for future collaborations. Thank you so much, Megan.
You're very welcome. It was great to be with you.